Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. Since the dawn of the automobile, humankind has looked upward, longing for a day when roads would no longer chain us to the earth. It wasn't just about getting somewhere faster, it was about freedom. The camera pans across aerial footage of endless traffic jams, their red taillights stretching like arteries of frustration across the landscape, then dissolves into vintage illustrations from the 1950s. Sleek, chrome-plated vehicles soaring through pristine blue skies, their occupants smiling with the confidence of a generation that believed technology could solve everything. The fantasy began almost the moment cars were invented. By the time the Wright brothers took flight in 1903, people were already wondering, why not both? The marriage of automobile and aircraft seemed not just logical, but inevitable. If Henry Ford could put America on wheels, and Orville and Wilbur Wright could lift humanity into the heavens, surely someone would combine these revolutionary technologies into something even more extraordinary. The earliest visionaries emerged from the same garages and workshops that birthed the automotive age. Glenn Curtiss, already famous for his motorcycles and early aircraft, unveiled his autoplane in 1917, a peculiar contraption that looked like a Model T had collided with a biplane and somehow survived the encounter. The autoplane never actually flew, managing only short hops down country roads, but it represented something profound, the first serious attempt to blur the line between terrestrial and aerial transportation. Curtiss understood what many would forget in the decades to come, that the flying car wasn't just an engineering challenge, it was a reimagining of human mobility itself. The dream lay dormant through the economic hardships of the 1920s and 1930s, but World War II changed everything. The conflict had turned entire nations into aviation powerhouses, churning out thousands of bombers, fighters, and transport planes with unprecedented efficiency. If wartime industry could mass-produce flying fortresses and Mustangs by the thousands, the reasoning went, surely peacetime ingenuity could craft personal flying vehicles for everyday citizens. The post-war optimism was intoxicating. Atomic energy would power our homes, rocket ships would ferry us to work, and flying cars would liberate us from the mundane tyranny of traffic lights and speed limits. Popular mechanics became the prophet of this airborne future, its covers regularly featuring illustrations of suburban families piloting sleek aircraft from their driveways to downtown office buildings. The magazine's editors confidently predicted that by 1970, every American garage would house a flying car alongside the family sedan. The imagery was seductive. Mothers dropping children off at school via Skylane, businessmen commuting through three-dimensional highways carved from clouds, weekend getaways that began with a vertical takeoff from the backyard. The future looked effortless, elegant, and inevitably aerial. But turning fantasy into functionality proved problematic. The engineers who tackled the flying car challenge in the 1940s and 1950s quickly discovered that they weren't just trying to build a better mousetrap. They were attempting to create a completely new category of transportation that satisfied the contradictory demands of both automotive and aviation engineering. The vehicle needed to be light enough to fly but robust enough to survive highway crashes. It required wings for lift but couldn't be too wide for city streets. It had to be simple enough for average drivers to operate but sophisticated enough to navigate three-dimensional airspace safely. Moulton Taylor understood these contradictions better than most. His Aerocar, first flown in 1949, represented the most serious attempt to solve the flying car puzzle. Taylor's design was elegant in its simplicity, a conventional car that could be converted into an aircraft by attaching detachable wings and a pusher propeller. The transformation took about 5 minutes and required no special tools. On the road, the Aerocar looked like a slightly odd sedan with its wings folded and towed behind on a trailer. In the air, it became a competent light aircraft capable of cruising at 100 miles per hour. The Aerocar was more than a prototype. It was a fully functional, road-legal, FAA-approved flying car. Taylor demonstrated it at air shows across the country, driving it onto airport runways, attaching the wings, and taking to the skies as amazed crowds watched from below. The vehicle handled well both on the ground and in the air, proving that the basic concept was sound. Yet despite generating enormous public interest and even securing investment from major corporations, only 6 aerocars were ever manufactured. The problem wasn't technical feasibility, it was economics and practicality. The Convair Model 101H represented a different approach, one that would become a cautionary tale for the entire industry. Developed by the same company that built military aircraft, the Model 118 was designed as a true hybrid, a car plane that could operate seamlessly in both environments without requiring assembly or modification. The prototype featured a sleek fiberglass body, conventional car controls and retractable wings. On paper, it was everything the flying car enthusiasts had dreamed of. In reality, it became a nightmare. During its first test flight in 1947, the Model 118 crashed, killing its pilot. The cause wasn't aerodynamic failure or structural weakness. It was a simple fuel mix-up. The ground crew had filled the aircraft with automotive gasoline instead of aviation fuel, causing the engine to lose power during flight. The crash highlighted one of the fundamental challenges facing flying cars, the complexity of maintaining 2 completely different transportation systems within a single vehicle. Every component had to meet both automotive and aviation standards, every fuel system had to account for different operating requirements, and every safety protocol had to address scenarios that didn't exist in either traditional cars or conventional aircraft. The engineering nightmare went far beyond fuel systems. Weight represented an almost insurmountable challenge. Aircraft needed to be as light as possible to achieve efficient flight, while automobiles required substantial mass to provide crashworthiness and stability. The wings necessary for flight made the vehicle impractically wide for most roads and parking spaces. The high-performance engines required for vertical takeoff consumed fuel at rates that made operation prohibitively expensive. The control systems needed to safely navigate 3-dimensional airspace were far too complex for average drivers to master. More fundamentally, the flying car existed in a regulatory no-man's land. The Federal Aviation Administration controlled airspace but had no authority over ground vehicles. The Department of Transportation regulated automobiles but had no expertise in aviation safety. Each prototype had to satisfy both agencies simultaneously, meeting crashworthiness standards that assumed ground-only operation, while also conforming to flight certification requirements that presumed dedicated aircraft. The paperwork alone could take years, and even successful certification didn't guarantee market viability. Engineers interviewed decades later would speak with a mixture of pride and frustration about their experiences. "We could make it fly," recalled one veteran of the Aerocar project. "We just couldn't make it practical." The sentiment echoed throughout the industry. The fundamental technologies existed, but the integration challenges proved overwhelming. Every solution created new problems, every optimization in one area compromised performance in another. The flying car remained tantalizingly possible yet impossibly complex. Even as engineers failed, fiction soared. The 1962 debut of the Jetsons crystallized the flying car dream in the public imagination like nothing before. George Jetson's aerodynamic family vehicle, with its transparent bubble canopy and effortless vertical flight, represented the platonic ideal of personal aviation. The car required no runway, no pilot training, no complex maintenance. It simply lifted off from the apartment balcony and whisked the family to their destination. The Jetsons made flying cars look not just possible but inevitable, a natural evolution of transportation technology that would arrive as predictably as colour television or automatic dishwashers. Hollywood embraced the concept with increasing sophistication. Blade Runner's Spinner vehicles in 1982 presented a darker vision, flying cars as symbols of technological stratification, where only the elite could afford to rise above the urban decay below. Star Wars treated flying vehicles as mundane transportation, no more remarkable than contemporary automobiles. Luke Skywalker's land speeder and the various speeders and swoops throughout the galaxy suggested a future where personal flight was so commonplace as to be unremarkable. Back to the Future Part 2 in 1989 brought flying cars into contemporary context, literally lifting a DeLorean off the ground and into 2015. The film's vision was playful yet plausible. Existing cars retrofitted with hover technology, traffic patterns extended into 3 dimensions, and flying becoming as routine as parallel parking. When Doc Brown modified the DeLorean time machine with a hover conversion, It felt like a logical upgrade rather than science fiction fantasy. The movie suggested that flying cars weren't a replacement for existing transportation, but an evolution of it. These fictional portrayals shaped public expectations in profound ways. Audiences saw characters piloting flying vehicles with the casual competence of experienced drivers, never struggling with complex flight controls or worrying about mechanical failures. The vehicles themselves appeared maintenance-free, fuel-efficient and accident-proof. Fiction created a baseline expectation that flying cars would be not just technologically possible, but practically superior to ground-based transportation in every way. Scientists and futurists appearing on programs like 60 Minutes throughout the 1970s and 1980s fed these expectations with confident predictions. Aviation experts explained how advances in materials science, computer control and propulsion technology were bringing flying cars ever closer to reality. They spoke of prototypes in development, test flights proving feasibility, and commercial availability within the next decade. Each prediction proved premature, but the steady drumbeat of expert optimism kept the dream alive in public consciousness. The disconnect between fictional promise and engineering reality created a peculiar cultural phenomenon, the perpetually imminent flying car. Like fusion power or artificial intelligence, flying cars existed in a state of permanent technological adolescence, always just a few years away from maturity. This temporal displacement allowed the concept to remain exciting without ever having to confront the mundane realities of insurance costs, parking regulations, or pilot certification requirements. Enter the tech revolution, new money, new minds, new hype. The late 2000s brought a fresh wave of entrepreneurs to the flying car challenge, armed with Silicon Valley confidence and venture capital funding. These weren't traditional aerospace engineers content to build one-off prototypes. They were tech visionaries who believed that software, automation and manufacturing innovation could solve problems that had stymied the industry for decades. Terrafugia emerged as the poster child of this new approach. Founded by MIT graduates with aerospace engineering backgrounds, the company promised to deliver the first practical flying car through modern design principles and contemporary technology. Their transition vehicle featured folding wings that eliminated the need for detachable components, modern avionics that simplified flight operations, and a business model that envisioned flying cars as the next major consumer technology category. The transition looked impressive in promotional videos, a sleek four-wheeled vehicle that could unfold its wings and transform into a light aircraft within minutes. The company secured significant investment, generated enormous media attention, and accumulated hundreds of pre-orders from customers eager to own the first commercially available flying car. Yet despite years of development and multiple prototype iterations, the transition never achieved commercial success. The few units delivered to customers proved expensive, complicated, and impractical for regular use. PAL-V, Aeromobile, and dozens of other startups followed similar trajectories. Each promised revolutionary advances over previous attempts, each generated impressive demonstration videos, and each ultimately struggled to bridge the gap between prototype and product. The fundamental challenges hadn't changed. Flying cars remained expensive to build, difficult to operate, and impossible to integrate into existing transportation infrastructure. The most ambitious attempt came from an unexpected source: Uber. The ride-sharing company's Elevate initiative promised to bypass the flying car problem entirely by focusing on electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, EVTOLs, designed for short urban flights. Rather than trying to build vehicles that could both drive and fly, Uber proposed a network of electric aircraft that would operate like aerial taxis, ferrying passengers between dedicated landing pads located throughout major cities. The EVTOL concept addressed many traditional flying car limitations. The vehicles didn't need to be road legal, eliminating automotive safety requirements. They could be optimized purely for flight, improving efficiency and reducing complexity. Most importantly, they would be operated by professional pilots, rather than untrained consumers, addressing the most serious safety concerns. Uber's vision was compelling. Imagine summoning an aerial taxi through a smartphone app, bypassing ground traffic entirely for short-distance urban transportation. Multiple companies developed EVTOL prototypes, including established aerospace manufacturers like Boeing and Bell, as well as startups like Joby Aviation and Lilium. The vehicles featured electric propulsion for quiet operation, autonomous flight capabilities to reduce pilot workload, and designs optimized for frequent short flights rather than long-distance travel. Test flights proved the basic concept, and several companies secured significant investment from major corporations and government agencies. Yet even the eVTOL approach encountered massive regulatory obstacles. The Federal Aviation Administration had to develop entirely new certification categories for electric aircraft, establish safety standards for urban air mobility, and create air traffic management systems capable of handling hundreds of small aircraft operating in crowded airspace. The process moved slowly, with each regulatory hurdle requiring years of documentation, testing, and review. The infrastructure requirements proved equally daunting. eVTOL operations required dedicated landing pads with charging facilities, passenger terminals, and ground transportation connections. Urban areas would need noise abatement measures to address community concerns about aircraft operating over residential neighbourhoods. The economics remained challenging. eVTOL operations would be expensive enough to limit ridership to affluent passengers, potentially creating a two-tiered transportation system that resembled the dystopian visions of Blade Runner more than the egalitarian future of the Jetsons. Critics pointed out a fundamental conceptual problem with both traditional flying cars and eVTOLs. They weren't really flying cars in the popular imagination. They were aircraft that could drive like cars, or aircraft that operated like aerial taxis. The seamless integration of automotive and aviation functionality that had captured public imagination remained elusive. Regulatory agencies agreed, often noting in their commentary, "It's not a flying car, it's an aircraft that drives like a car." The skies remained clear, not from traffic, but from disappointment. After more than a century of attempts, the flying car seemed as far from reality as ever. The core problems that had defeated earlier generations of inventors persisted, seemingly immune to advances in material science, computer technology, and manufacturing techniques. Safety represented the most fundamental obstacle. Traditional automobiles operated in a highly regulated two-dimensional environment with established rules, trained operators, and extensive infrastructure. Even minor accidents typically involve property damage rather than fatalities. Aviation, by contrast, operated in three dimensions with far less forgiveness for operator error or mechanical failure. Aircraft accidents almost invariably resulted in serious injury or death. Combining these two transportation modes meant accepting aviation-level risks for automotive-level utility. The prospect of untrained pilots operating in busy urban airspace terrified aviation safety experts. Commercial aviation's exceptional safety record resulted from rigorous pilot training, strict maintenance protocols, and sophisticated air traffic control systems. None of these safeguards could practically extend to personal flying vehicles operated by drivers whose qualifications might extend no further than a standard automobile license. The potential for mid-air collisions, crashes into buildings, or emergency landings in populated areas made mass adoption of flying cars a public safety nightmare. Maintenance costs represented another insurmountable barrier. Aircraft required far more intensive maintenance than automobiles, with federal regulations mandating periodic inspections by certified technicians. A typical light aircraft might require hundreds or thousands of dollars in annual maintenance costs, while automobile maintenance rarely exceeded a few $100s per year. Flying cars would need to satisfy both automotive and aviation maintenance requirements, potentially doubling or tripling ownership costs. The technological barriers remained formidable despite decades of advances. Efficient vertical takeoff still required enormous amounts of power, limiting range and requiring frequent recharging or refueling. The energy density of batteries, while improving steadily, remained far below the requirements for practical electric flight. Weight optimization remained a zero-sum game. Every pound added for automotive crashworthiness reduced flight performance, while every pound saved for flight efficiency compromised ground safety. Noise pollution presented an often overlooked limitation. Aircraft engines, even modern ones, generated far more noise than automobile engines. A flying car taking off from a suburban driveway would create noise levels comparable to a helicopter, disturbing entire neighbourhoods. Multiplied across thousands of daily operations, flying cars would transform quiet residential areas into industrial-level noise environments. Community resistance to such disruption would likely prevent widespread adoption, regardless of technological feasibility. The infrastructure requirements defied practical implementation. Flying cars needed runways or landing pads, air traffic control systems, refueling facilities, and maintenance hangars. These requirements couldn't be satisfied by existing automotive infrastructure. Gas stations couldn't service aircraft, parking lots couldn't accommodate wingspan requirements, and residential garages couldn't handle vertical takeoff operations. Building parallel infrastructure for flying cars would require massive public and private investment, with no guarantee of adoption. Perhaps most fundamentally, flying cars weren't scalable. Aviation worked well for long-distance transportation, where the time and expense of flight preparation justified the speed advantages. For short-distance urban transportation, the primary use case for personal vehicles, the overhead of flight operations eliminated most efficiency gains. Taking off, climbing to safe altitude, and landing often required more time than simply driving the same distance, especially when accounting for pre-flight safety checks and post-flight securing procedures. The economics never made sense for mass adoption. Flying cars would inevitably cost far more than conventional automobiles while providing marginal utility improvements for most users. The wealthy early adopters who could afford flying cars rarely faced the traffic congestion problems that flying cars were supposed to solve. They typically lived in low-density areas with efficient transportation infrastructure. The urban commuters who most needed alternatives to ground transportation couldn't afford flying cars and lacked the infrastructure to operate them. Still, the dream won't die, not entirely. The persistent failure of flying cars to achieve commercial success hasn't dampened public fascination or eliminated technological development. If anything, recent advances in drone technology, artificial intelligence, and battery systems have rekindled optimism among both entrepreneurs and enthusiasts. Drone technology has revolutionized the feasibility of autonomous flight. Modern quadcopters can navigate complex three-dimensional environments, avoid obstacles, and land safely with minimal human input. Scaling these capabilities to human-carrying vehicles seems more achievable than ever before. Artificial intelligence systems have demonstrated the ability to manage complex transportation networks, optimize routing in real time, and coordinate multiple vehicles simultaneously. These technologies could potentially address the safety and traffic management challenges that have historically made flying cars impractical. Battery improvements, while still falling short of aviation requirements, have made electric flight increasingly viable for short-distance applications. Electric propulsion offers several advantages over traditional aircraft engines: lower noise levels, reduced maintenance requirements, and the potential for distributed propulsion systems that improve safety through redundancy. Several companies have demonstrated battery-powered aircraft capable of carrying passengers for distances of 50 to 100 miles, suggesting that electric flying cars might soon become technically feasible, if not economically practical. The most promising developments are occurring in Asia, where government support for advanced transportation technologies is stronger and regulatory obstacles are lower. Dubai has committed to implementing flying taxi services by 2030, with dedicated landing pads and air traffic management systems designed specifically for urban air mobility. China has invested heavily in eVTOL development, with several companies conducting test flights in major cities. These initiatives suggest that flying cars might find their first commercial applications in markets with strong government support and less regulatory complexity. Autonomous flying taxi prototypes are operating in controlled environments, carrying passengers on predetermined routes between established landing sites. While these services remain experimental and limited in scope, they represent the first practical implementation of the flying car concept for commercial transportation. The vehicles don't match the seamless road-to-air capability envisioned in popular culture, but they do provide genuine aerial mobility for urban passengers. Industry experts increasingly speculate that flying cars might actually happen, but not in the way popular imagination had envisioned. Rather than personal vehicles owned and operated by individual drivers, flying cars might emerge as professionally operated services similar to current ride-sharing platforms. Rather than seamlessly transitioning between ground and air operations, they might function as specialized aircraft operating between dedicated terminals. Rather than replacing conventional automobiles, they might supplement existing transportation networks for specific high-value routes. This vision lacks the romantic appeal of the traditional flying car fantasy. There's nothing particularly exciting about riding as a passenger in an autonomous aircraft from one designated landing pad to another, especially when the experience would likely resemble a noisy, expensive helicopter ride, more than the effortless aerial freedom depicted in science fiction. Yet this compromise approach might finally deliver some version of the flying car dream to actual consumers, even if the reality falls short of the century-old fantasy. The regulatory environment is slowly adapting to accommodate urban air mobility. The Federal Aviation Administration has established new aircraft categories for eVTOLs and is developing certification standards specifically for urban air taxi operations. European and Asian aviation authorities are pursuing similar initiatives, suggesting that the regulatory barriers that have historically prevented flying car deployment might gradually diminish. However, significant obstacles remain. Public acceptance of flying vehicles operating over urban areas is far from assured, especially given legitimate concerns about noise, safety, and equity. The infrastructure investments required for widespread deployment remain enormous and largely unfunded. The economic case for flying cars remains marginal for most potential users, limiting the market to affluent early adopters and specific niche applications. Environmental concerns add another layer of complexity. While electric propulsion might reduce direct emissions, the energy requirements for vertical flight remain enormous compared to ground transportation. The carbon footprint of flying cars would likely exceed conventional automobiles significantly, making widespread adoption environmentally problematic during a period of increasing climate consciousness. The flying car became more than a machine. It became a symbol of possibility, of escape, of progress unchained. For over a century, the concept has represented humanity's refusal to accept transportation limitations, our persistent belief that technology can transcend physical constraints, and our enduring desire for personal freedom and mobility. The flying car embodies the optimistic futurism that characterized much of the 20th century, when technological progress seemed inevitable, and every engineering challenge appeared solvable given sufficient time and resources. Yet the flying car also symbolizes the gap between technological possibility and practical implementation. It demonstrates how cultural expectations, shaped by fiction and marketing, can diverge dramatically from engineering reality. The persistent failure of flying cars to achieve commercial success reveals the complexity of modern technological development, where success requires not just technical feasibility but also economic viability, regulatory approval, social acceptance, and infrastructure compatibility. The story of the flying car is ultimately a story about human aspiration confronting physical reality. Every generation of inventors and entrepreneurs has approached the challenge with confidence that contemporary technology would finally unlock the solution that had eluded their predecessors. Each has discovered that the fundamental problems, safety, cost, complexity, and practicality, persist regardless of technological advances. Each has contributed incremental progress, while falling short of the transformative breakthrough that the flying car represents. Perhaps the flying car's greatest value lies not in its potential as transportation technology, but in its function as inspiration. The dream of personal flight has motivated countless innovations in aviation, automotive technology, materials science, and computer systems. The pursuit of flying cars has advanced human knowledge and capability, even when it hasn't delivered practical flying cars. The engineers who failed to build successful flying cars often succeeded in creating technologies that found applications in conventional aircraft, automobiles, and other industries. The flying car also serves as a useful reminder of technological humility. Despite extraordinary advances in computing, materials, and manufacturing, some engineering challenges remain stubbornly difficult. The integration of complex systems, the management of competing requirements, and the optimization of conflicting objectives continue to challenge even the most sophisticated technological capabilities. The flying car demonstrates that technological progress, while real and significant, doesn't always follow the linear trajectory that popular culture expects. Looking ahead, the flying car dream may finally achieve some form of realization, albeit in a form quite different from popular imagination. Urban air mobility services might provide aerial transportation for specific routes and passenger segments. Autonomous flying vehicles might operate in controlled environments under professional management. Electric propulsion and artificial intelligence might address some of the safety and efficiency concerns that have historically prevented flying car deployment. Yet even if these developments succeed, they're unlikely to deliver the complete transformation of personal transportation that the flying car has long represented. The skies above our cities may never fill with personal flying vehicles operated by ordinary drivers, just as our garages may never house aircraft alongside our automobiles. The regulatory, economic and practical barriers that have prevented mass adoption of flying cars for over a century remain formidable despite technological advances. The flying car may thus remain forever in the future, always just a few years away from commercial availability, perpetually promising to revolutionise transportation while never quite delivering on that promise. This temporal displacement has become part of the flying car's identity. It exists most powerfully as anticipation rather than reality, as possibility rather than fact. The psychological appeal of flying cars extends beyond mere transportation efficiency. They represent escape from the mundane constraints of surface-bound existence, liberation from traffic jams and road rage, freedom to chart direct courses through three-dimensional space. The flying car promises to transform the daily commute from a grinding necessity into an adventure, to make travel spontaneous rather than planned, to restore the romance of mobility that has been lost in contemporary automotive culture. This emotional resonance explains why the flying car concept survives repeated commercial failures and technological setbacks. Each new prototype, each demonstration flight, each entrepreneur's pitch rekindles the same fundamental hope that has captivated human imagination for over a century. The dream proves remarkably resilient to disappointing reality because it addresses deeper psychological needs than simple transportation efficiency. The flying car also embodies distinctly American cultural values: individualism, technological optimism, and the belief that personal freedom can be enhanced through engineering innovation. The concept emerged during the same era that celebrated the automobile as a symbol of personal liberation and democratic access to mobility. Flying cars represented the logical extension of automotive freedom into the third dimension, promising to democratize the skies just as automobiles had democratized ground transportation. Yet this democratic promise has always been undermined by the inherent complexity and cost of aviation technology. Flying cars have consistently remained expensive toys for wealthy enthusiasts, rather than practical transportation for ordinary citizens. The egalitarian vision of flying cars in every garage has given way to the reality of flying cars as luxury goods for the affluent few, creating a technological divide that mirrors broader patterns of economic inequality. The international dimensions of flying car development reveal different cultural approaches to technological innovation and risk acceptance. American efforts have been dominated by private entrepreneurs, operating in a complex regulatory environment that prioritizes safety over innovation speed. European initiatives have emphasized coordinated government-industry partnerships with strong environmental considerations. Asian programs have focused on rapid deployment and government-supported infrastructure development. These different approaches suggest that flying cars might succeed first in regions with strong government support, unified regulatory frameworks, and cultural acceptance of technological risk. The American model of private innovation within restrictive regulatory constraints may prove less effective than Asian approaches that integrate government planning with industrial development. The COVID-19 pandemic has added new urgency to urban air mobility concepts, as cities seek transportation alternatives that reduce crowding and disease transmission. The prospect of personal aerial vehicles that avoid shared spaces and crowded terminals has renewed interest in flying cars as public health tools rather than mere convenience technologies. This medical justification provides new political and economic arguments for overcoming traditional barriers to flying car deployment. Climate change considerations increasingly influence flying car development priorities. Electric propulsion systems, while still limited by battery technology, offer the potential for carbon-neutral flight operations if powered by renewable energy sources. Some advocates argue that electric flying cars could actually reduce transportation emissions by enabling more efficient point-to-point travel that bypasses congested ground infrastructure. However, life cycle analysis suggests that flying cars would likely increase overall energy consumption significantly compared to ground transportation alternatives. The energy requirements for vertical takeoff and sustained flight far exceed those for rolling resistance and aerodynamic drag in surface vehicles. Even with perfect electric propulsion, widespread flying car adoption would require massive increases in electrical generation capacity. The generational aspects of flying car acceptance are particularly interesting. Younger consumers who have grown up with drone technology and video game flight simulators may prove more comfortable with personal aviation than previous generations. The gamification of flight through consumer electronics has familiarized millions of people with three-dimensional navigation and aircraft control principles. This experiential base could accelerate flying car adoption if technological and regulatory barriers can be overcome. Conversely, the aging population in developed countries may prefer ground-based transportation that doesn't require the physical coordination and spatial awareness necessary for flight operations. The demographic trends toward urbanization and aging may actually reduce the market for personal flying vehicles even as the technology becomes more practical. The philosophical implications of flying cars extend beyond transportation into questions about human relationship with natural and built environments. Flying cars would fundamentally alter the urban landscape by making building height and street layout less relevant to transportation efficiency. Cities designed around flying car transportation might develop very different spatial patterns, with implications for community formation, social interaction, and environmental impact. The noise pollution aspects of flying cars deserve particular attention, given their potential impact on urban livability. Current aircraft noise levels would be intolerable if multiplied across thousands of daily flying car operations in residential neighbourhoods. Breakthrough advances in quiet propulsion technology would be necessary to make flying cars socially acceptable in urban environments. The insurance and liability frameworks for flying cars remain largely undeveloped despite decades of prototype testing. Aviation insurance operates on fundamentally different principles than automotive insurance, reflecting the higher risks and greater potential for catastrophic losses in aircraft operations. Flying cars would require new insurance categories that address unique risks while maintaining affordable coverage for consumer markets. Professional pilot shortages in commercial aviation raise questions about training requirements for flying car operators. If flying cars require licensed pilots, the training pipeline would need massive expansion to support widespread adoption. If flying cars can be operated by drivers with minimal additional training, safety risks increase dramatically. The tension between accessibility and safety remains unresolved in flying car development. The cultural impact of successful flying car deployment would extend far beyond transportation into entertainment, recreation, and lifestyle choices. Flying cars would enable new forms of tourism, recreation, and social interaction, while potentially disrupting existing industries and employment patterns. The secondary effects of flying car adoption might prove more significant than the primary transportation benefits. And maybe one day, we'll look up and see that dream finally arrive. The sound of jet engines hums faintly in the distance as a silhouetted vehicle glides across the twilight sky, its occupants finally free from the constraints that have bound human transportation to the Earth's surface for so long. Whether that day comes in the next decade or the next century, whether the vehicles resemble our current expectations or take forms we haven't yet imagined, the dream itself endures, a testament to human ambition and our perpetual desire to transcend the limitations of the present. The sky was never the limit, it was always the destination.